It's 3:10, so let's make a start. Thank you for coming. My name's Chris. I work at the University of Edinburgh. Hello, come in. Just before we actually get onto the main topic, so I believe at lunchtime we were discussing a possible name change to BALEAP. Did anyone take part in that discussion? No? Okay. You did? Are we changing our name, do you know?
There was no decision taken.
Say again?
And it looks like it's going to continue to be discussed for another couple of years.
Oh, okay.
It seems to be quite slow.
Okay. Well, good. I'm glad we haven't made a final decision because I've got a comment. I've got a suggestion for the BALEAP name change. So BALEAP stands for British Association of Lecturers for English for Academic Purposes. The British is just unnecessary. Hello, come in. So you should remove that part. We don't need the B. The association, that's fine. Lecturers, I think that's quite exclusive. Well, not all lecturers. And probably the most inclusive word there we can find is professional. And BALEAP already says it's like the professional EAP network. So that would work. As for EAP, well, there's elements of that I would suggest we keep, but it doesn't maybe capture everything. So change to include academic literacies, but still retain English language. So that's my kind of analysis, and that leads to a name change of the Professional Academic English Language and Literacy Association. I think that's a recipe for success. It's got all the key ingredients. Anyway, so that side, although I am going to come back to this, well, not the name change, but this will come up later. So this talk is titled Beyond the Text, Integrating Tasks and Actions in EAP, and the theme of the conference is EAP under deconstruction, and so I tried to think critically about EAP pedagogy and what we might want to change, thinking about the future, how I might reconceptualize things. And what I'm going to be arguing is that within EAP pedagogy, what we really need to focus on is tasks and actions more than simply texts, more than just the analysis and production of texts. So, first of all, I'm going to look at a couple of frameworks to analyse things, and then I'm going to move through thinking of reception, mediation, production, and then interaction. So, first of all then, the frameworks. And we've got two organising frameworks. Well, first of all though, one of our main existing organisational frameworks is the 4 skills. And I don't need to explain what these are, but these are ever present in language and language teaching and language assessment. These are a lens through which we conceptualise language and teaching. Yesterday, in the Room 101 session, we collectively voted to put IELTS into Room 101. And I sympathise. And a lot of the issues that we have is that IELTS uses this model, this lens, and this becomes the model and the lens that we look through. However, I didn't vote to put IELTS in Room 101 because I don't think that's entirely the fault of IELTS. I think it's our own fault as a sector. And what I mean by that, if we look at all of our university websites, when they talk about language proficiency, what is required for university entry, universities choose to ask for IELTS or IELTS equivalent. So the pervasiveness of IELTS is as much our own responsibility as blaming an outside test. But that does perhaps mean that we have the power, or we should at least have the power, to try and change things to a different model. Another thing that we put into Room 101 yesterday was this idea that the wider university doesn't know what we do in EAP. We just do grammar teaching, or we just do this and that. But then again, if we allow If we allow the description of what we do to just be referenced through the lens of IELTS, that sends a message to the wider universities that all we do is top up students' IELTS levels. So if we agree to that, then we're kind of complicit in demeaning our own profession. So I think there's several reasons that came out yesterday that I would add to my own argument about why we should move away from the 4 skills. And as to what we should move to, well, this isn't even my idea, and it's not particularly new. This is the CEFR, which I'm sure that you're all familiar with, but particularly in their model of language, this is what they state. The CEFR replaces the traditional model of the 4 skills, which has increasingly proved inadequate to capture the complex reality of communication. And instead, the CEFR has reception, production, mediation, and interaction. And so this is one of the frameworks that I'm going to be talking about today, and applying this to EAP pedagogy. Very commonly, the 4 skills are represented in terms of texts. And in EAP contexts, we often find that our text for reading is represented by research articles, writing by essays, whatever they may be, listening through lectures, and speaking through presentations. And these are all valuable texts, and I'm not dismissing them, but in thinking about what is valuable in pedagogy, we need more than just the text, more than just the analysis and the production of objects. The other organising framework that I'm going to be using is Bloom's Taxonomy. I expect you're familiar with it. It's usually shown in a triangular format representing a hierarchy. I'll put it just on a table here. I've simplified the number of actions, and I've added numbers. I would say don't get too focused on the meaning of numbers. It's just a kind of loose heuristic to help us understand the higher level and lower level actions. What I think is particularly important when we think about Bloom's taxonomy, some people talk about this about higher order thinking skills and lower order thinking skills. But the way that I'm using it and applying it is actually thinking about actions and possibly even learning outcomes. Okay, so back to paella, more importantly. If we express learning outcomes rather than picking whatever EAP topic, in this lesson I will explain how to cook paella. As a learning outcome, as a description of a learning activity, this is not good enough. This explains things from what the teacher will do in the lesson. It's not student focused. Even this one, in this lesson, you will make a paella. Now this is student focused, but this still is not action focused. It's activity focused. So yes, the students will make paella, but we need more than this. Something along the lines of, by the end of the lesson, you will be able to make paella. And the distinction is subtle, but it is important. It's not just that at the end there is a finished paella, it's that the student, by the end of it, understands all the steps and the processes that they have been through. And if you wanted to break that down into sub-skills or sub-outcomes, then you'd be talking about your kind of preparing ingredients, sautéing, simmering, serving, and so on. And so these outcomes, these actions, these are also important in how we conceptualize EAP pedagogy about what students do in lessons, in courses. So that was the framework, and we're going to move on now and look at reception, which encompasses both reading and listening, but here presented together. I'll let you look at this slide for a moment. So this is quite a simplistic dichotomy about different approaches to reading, with perhaps more text text-oriented pedagogies, taking quite an isolated approach with lower level sub-skills and so on, and perhaps more action-oriented approaches, having a more integrated approach with higher level sub-skills. And some particular actions that we have include arcs and seminars. Specifically, an approach to pedagogy that has been talked about quite a bit today, actually, has been genre analysis. And I went to Philip Nathan's session this morning where he talked about genre analysis, and Steve Kirk referenced it in his session just before lunch as well. Now, genre analysis is very important and very influential, and I've used it a lot in my own teaching, and I'm not trying to dismiss its importance at all. However, there is still the danger that it's focusing purely on texts rather than what students do. And the reason that I put numbers onto Bloom's taxonomy earlier is so that here, these are some possible learning outcomes that would describe what students do in a genre analysis lesson. And when we put the numbers on, we've got 2 and 4 here, which are relatively middle or low in terms of the higher and lower actions from the taxonomy. And while there might be genre analysis lessons that do more than this, in general, there is the danger that a purely text-focused approach to lessons doesn't employ high-level actions, and therefore we're not giving students the opportunity to really develop their high-level skills. In contrast, a different approach is academic reading circles. Much has been written and talked about these, and a lot of us know that they're very good. But why? Why are they good? In particular, they're student-centred, and they focus on content, and they employ high-level actions. The most commonly known model of reading circles is that written by Tyson Seaburn a few years ago, which is an excellent book. Those 5 roles from Seaburn, if we describe the actions there, using our Bloom's framework, what we find with the different roles, we've got 4s and 5s and 6s going on. So the actual roles of the reading circles, when we describe the learning outcomes of that task cycle, then we find that by completing that task cycle, students are developing a range of high-level skills as a result. This analysis does perhaps suggest that the highlighter role is not very high. The highlighter role is an approach and a role that analyses language, vocabulary, phrases, and so on. I would argue that rather than having that as a role in the reading circle, it is just something that all students should do with every text. So there are some adaptations that we can make to reading circles. We could perhaps remove the highlighter role, or just say that everyone should do it with every text. The visualizer role, people have often commented that it's difficult for certain students and it can be impossible for certain texts, so we can make that optional. Some possible additional roles. Well, we've got a genre analyst here, so rather than having genre analysis as the whole underpinning approach to pedagogy, we can include it in courses, but as one of the reading circle roles. So it's still there, but just as one of many different approaches to reading. And another possible role there is a summarizer. One comment about reading circles, which is often missed, and this is something that Seaburn said in his book, you need to do every role once. So if you have 5 roles, you have to do at least 5 reading circles. You can't do 3, because then students don't do each role and they're missing out. So you have to go for it hook, line and sinker. But if we move away from reading and listening more to reception, we can have an approach where the circles could be done for a blend of both listening texts and reading texts. That would work, and students would still be developing these sub-skills. And in particular, the sub-skills, some of the sub-skills that are being developed are ones of mediation. And there's a definition here that you can read. Mediation, described in the CEFR, is a bit of a woolly concept, and it's a bit of an umbrella concept. And it's not immediately obvious from the name what's being talked about, but what some of the key skills in EAP are actually contained in mediation. And so to exemplify, it's quite common to talk about reading into writing as an EAP task, and much has been said about this. What's important to identify is that there's more going on here than just reading comprehension plus written production. And back to paella. What we have here is a list of ingredients for paella, and here is a finished dish. This is not enough to describe how students or how a person can actually make paella. What's missing is the process, the instructions, the recipe. How do you get from the ingredients to the finished dish? And so going back to reading into writing, there's a lot more going on than just reading comprehension and written production. Summarising, paraphrasing, synthesising, analysis, critique, comment, comparison, they are all going on in this task, and these can all be described and analysed under the concept of mediation. So rather than squeezing more and more sub-skills under the umbrella of writing, we can actually separate things out into their own category of mediation. And so rather than calling this reading into writing, we can perhaps call it reading mediated writing. And if we get on to possible marking criteria for such a task, then we can separate things out into perhaps 3 macro categories of reading, mediation, and writing. This approach, I would argue, better describes what is going on in such an EAP task, and it also helps with the kind of description of equivalence. If we talk about IELTS equivalent, well, IELTS doesn't really include any mediation, so what we can say in the EAP task, well, you've got reading and writing, and we can have equivalence to that, and then we've got a lot more, and that's described in mediation. So it also helps to differentiate what we do from what perhaps more general tests and tasks do. With mediation, there's lots of possible tasks and approaches that can elicit mediation. And if you actually look at the tasks, all of these are things that already exist in EAP. So there's nothing particularly new about talking about a presentation, a summary of a lecture, discussion, and so on. But if you look at the left-hand column, talking about reading mediated writing, reading mediated speaking, and so on, the use of mediation can really help to identify what students have been asked to do, what is going on in the task, and really thinking about the process that students go to get from reception to production. So, moving on to production then. And in my abstract, I said I was going to talk about listening into speaking, which I will. I'm just going to briefly talk about writing tasks for the purpose of talking about AI, which I've added relatively last minute. There's been much talk about generative AI and what that means for EAP assessment. What I would argue is, that one way we can mitigate the potential problems is to really think about the process. So not just the final product, not just the final text that students submit, but all the steps that they go through to lead up to the creation of that text. And so that could be more closely monitoring, for example, any of these stages that might exist: plan, A/B, evidence of reading, draft stages and tutorials. It would be possible to have a more formal tutorial focus where at an intermediary stage you have these questions. Have you found an article? Have you read it? Can you link it to your essay? What I would say with this as an approach, what we absolutely shouldn't do is turn this into a speaking test with scores for pronunciation. Just treat it as a yes, no, yes, 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 jolly good. We know that you're on track, and no more higher stakes than that. But yeah, that would be one way of trying to mitigate the potential problems of AI. Okay, so back on to the topic of speaking, and very often with speaking in EAP, we approach it through the text of a presentation, and presentations are very important, absolutely. But a couple of issues. In terms of what's going on there, we can describe them as reading mediated speaking. If it is indeed a presentation based on reading, it could be based on listening, but usually it's reading. A couple of issues with that. In the description of speaking, there's not really any spontaneity. Perhaps a little bit in the follow-up questions, but in the actual main text, there's no spontaneity, and there's no interaction. It's just a monologue. And possibly, on a previous slide, we had all the different, well, not all, but lots of different possibilities for how we could have mediation. There's possibly the issue that we've got the same kind of mediation as in writing. If it's just a case of, here's a reading text, I've read it, or some text, and here's some critical analysis. So there's maybe duplication that we have in writing. As an alternative or an addition, a different kind of task can be a seminar, which would be a group speaking, and possibly based on listening. In this case, similar to our previous analysis, there is more going on than just listening, comprehension, plus spoken production. So in this kind of task, in a seminar where students go to a lecture and then discuss the content, there's a lot more than you would just get from a listening test plus a speaking test. And so what we can possibly get there is the rather wordy listening mediated interactional speaking, which doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. But as a description, this particular use of mediation can help to identify again what's going on in this task beyond just the comprehension and production of texts. Within mediation, you can get the summary, criticality, and opinion. And importantly, as well, by having interaction, there's all of the interactional competences that's required, plus there is much more spontaneity going on. And this will make for a less predictable assessment, perhaps more messy, but much more authentic, which I think is really valuable. And moving on, if we think about the actions that is elicited within a seminar, and using our kind of numerical representation of Bloom's taxonomy, some potential learning outcomes for a seminar task cycle. Well, we're going up there into 4s, 5s, and 6s. So we are accessing these higher order skills which our students need to develop. And just to mention as well, with the criteria, there's quite a lot going on there. So if we go down that road as an assessment for EAP, one approach could be to do everything together, but another would be to perhaps split it into two. And in one iteration, you assess listening and mediation, and then in the second iteration, you focus on interaction and speaking, which might make it easier for people to assess. As a final point about interaction, I'll very quickly wrap up. As a final point about interaction then, interaction is fundamental to language. I don't have time to go into depth, but in terms of how language evolved from interaction. Before our ancestors could actually use language to communicate, we interacted with body language. We still had complex societies, and language evolved from that interaction. So interaction is an essential part of language and the EAP construct. And a model of language, and our classic 4 skills model doesn't include interaction. A model of language that doesn't include interaction is missing the most important part. It's missing the key ingredient, like a paella without saffron. I've added one final slide, one penultimate slide. In Steve Kirk's presentation before lunch, he was talking about signature pedagogies, and he had some lenses from which to analyse pedagogy. So I've tried to add this in. It's a bit last minute, but what I would say about this kind of approach, it includes both genre and process, but above all, it's action oriented. It's thinking about what students do and what students learn to do as a result of the lesson. And the knowledge base, I think we need to move away from prescriptivism, so we don't tell students the details of texts, we get them to learn and discover the details. And so the values then is that this would make it fundamentally very student-centred, not teacher-led. And as the final slide, then, rather than a 4 skills model, I would suggest this as a framework for academic language and literacy, which is entirely derived from the CEFR. This is not kind of my own, really. But we've actually got 8 elements there rather than 4. And if we want to talk about equivalence, well, the first 4, reading, listening, writing and speaking, are still there. But in terms of description of academic literacy, we've got a lot more than is described in just a 4 skills model. Okay, and here are some references, and that's the end of my talk, so thank you for listening. And I think we've got a few minutes, have we, for questions or comments?
10 minutes.
10, yep, we've got 10 minutes for questions and comments. No, okay, thanks. Yes, please.
You started off talking about IELTS and how it doesn't reflect this approach to thinking about language. And you also, there's a comment in there about like thinking about more integrated tasks would make assessment messy. So were you talking about more like classroom assessment, or what are your thoughts about the extent to which this should be reflected in large-scale standardized assessments?
I think that for EAP courses, it is important to include all the elements, even if they are messy. With the BALEAP accreditation scheme, one of the central plinths of that is constructive alignment. And I remember going back a few years, nearly 10 years ago, when Diane Schmidt was the chair of BALEAP. She went on a bit of a crusade about kind of talking about constructive alignment and making sure and telling people to, with EAP assessment, to really reflect the content of EAP courses. And so EAP academic tasks are complex, and so that has to be reflected in courses and also assessment. So yeah, that's what I would say. However, standardized testing in terms of like standalone language tests, that's a bit of a different beast.
terms, reading mediated speaking and listening mediated interactional speaking, did you coin them yourselves? Can I reference you?
I think, well, yes, I think I did. I Googled reading mediated speaking and I didn't get any matches. But I'm not, someone else may have also used that term, so. Okay. Yeah, yes, please, go on.
Just a comment about the reading circle roles.
Yes.
I like the new roles you proposed, the summarizer.
Yes.
But I also think the summarizer, like the highlighter,
Yes.
should be done by all the students because it's good preparation for summarizing sources to use into their writing.
Yes.
So I think
Yep.
that could as well be,
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think actually on that, wherever it's gone there, yeah, the summarizer, yeah, 2 and 4. So that's not that high compared to some of the other roles. So yeah, I agree.
Sorry,
Yes,
this
please.
idea of reading circles is quite new to me. So is the idea that you do it like on a pre-sessional, you repeat it, and
Yeah.
students take different roles during the pre-sessional? Yeah, okay.
Yes. Yeah. I've been in the various contexts, both my current job and previous job. We've been using reading circles for many years, and in general, teachers find that both teachers and students find that they work really well. Ends up being very student centred, with the teacher taking quite almost a peripheral facilitator role, but really kind of standing back and just letting students get on with things. Yes, I really encourage you to use them if you've not done before.
I was just thinking, I just wanted to add to your point really about you're suggesting removing the highlighter because it's the lower order thinking skills, but I think it's important to develop those skills as well, so keeping it in there, because it's funny because in a previous talk we were discussing this and saying actually explaining, although it's a lower order skill, it still can be quite hard. So still getting that opportunity. I mean, the beauty of this is that you are reaching those higher order thinking skills as well, but not to eliminate the development of the lower order thinking skills, I think.
Well, yes, yeah, absolutely.
It can be quite hard.
Yeah. Yeah, I think over the years, I've had lots of conversations with teachers about the details of how to really make them work. And lots of people have like ideas, and lots of people have more experience than me. So, absolutely.
It's interesting, but the Bloom's taxonomy and those skills, I think it's a really good conversation to students, because I think they do struggle sometimes with explanations, but sometimes students who are very grade driven don't understand, because often lecturers or subject specific teachers don't explain those higher order thinking skills. So sometimes students who explain something really well don't understand why they haven't achieved a really high grade in their assessment. And so often in my role I have students coming to me and they'll say, they told me it was very clear and it was well explained, so why haven't I achieved a really good grade? So I think using it as a framework with students and explaining it to them is actually really beneficial.
Thank you. I think was there. Yeah.
I'm just going to add about the reading circles. I have also used them, and the roles, you can actually distribute the roles initially, and sometimes depending who your students are, you can get them to choose the roles. And this is what is great about having the different roles, because you think that student can be the highlighter, and then in another context, you can just offer them round as well. I've done a lot of reading circles, they're great. And they lead to these great seminar discussions where you can then get some great descriptors from mediation going up and get them to judge their performances, exchanging information.
Thank you. As another comment about reading circles and as well seminars, they end up being very lengthy discussions of a text, and what that can lead to is much more in-depth analysis of that text beyond just looking at genre features or language features or structure and so on, and really engaging in content. And so, for example, another session I went to this morning was Yolanda Thurder's about feminism in EAP, and she talked about discourses of inequality. It's possible to use texts that actually discuss those issues, and by having students discussing something for like an hour or more, there's the chance to really get involved in some very difficult and challenging texts, and that's another really valuable aspect of them as well. Yes?
Really good talk, Chris. Have you had a chance to somewhat compare mediated learning versus non-mediated learning, and what is the efficacy or the gain in efficacy by using mediation?
In terms of empirical research, no. But in terms of observational experience, yes. By moving to having courses and tasks that are integrated, the feedback from students is that it's better than, and feedback from both students and teachers in terms of in-course feedback, was that it was better than a course that was organised around 4 skills leading up to a 4 separate skills test at the end. So from that kind of observational aspect, then yes, I found it to be effective.
And just following up on a question I think that was asked from across the room, do you make all of this explicit to the students? Do you tell them this is what's happening, or is it more just you change the phrases and you just say by the end of the lesson you will know how to explain?
I strongly advocate being very specific about, and this is what I was saying about learning outcomes. Vague outcomes, vague aims they undermine things because they don't make explicit to students what the content and the purpose and the intended outcome is. So I would say any lesson needs specific outcomes. With a reading circle, that can be described in terms of the task cycle. So by the end of the task cycle, you will be able to do these 5 roles. And with, say, a reading into writing, where students are going through many different tasks, whether it's like planning, summarising, critiquing, researching, all of that can be described in terms of learning outcomes. For example, by the end of this task, by the end of this project, you will be able to do. And yeah, be specific about what you are asking students to do. Yeah, well, I think then that's at the end of our time. So thank you very much. And